Hey everyone, my name is Dylan Adams, and for today's video, we're going to talk about a seemingly small and insignificant thing that can actually have a massive impact on the way your guitar sounds and reacts to your playing. And that thing is your guitar's wiring style. Now, I'm not talking about push-pull pots, out of phase, coil split, coil tap, active versus passive. It's nothing like that. I'm going to be talking about what I consider to be the three most fundamental ways to wire up your guitar. And those three wiring styles are modern wiring, 50s wiring, and treble bleed wiring. We're going to talk about what that means. I'm going to demonstrate what the differences are between them. We'll discuss the pros and cons of each of them. And finally, I will tell you guys which wiring style I prefer. First things first, what do we actually mean when we say modern wiring or 50s wiring? So the only difference between these two is the way in which the tone capacitor is wired to the volume pot and the tone pot. So if you look at any normal non-push-pull guitar potentiometer, it's going to have 3 lugs on it. With modern wiring, the capacitor is wired to the first lug of the volume pot and the second lug of the tone pot. Whereas with 50s wiring, the capacitor is wired to the middle lug of the volume pot and the third lug of the tone pot. Now, I gotta be honest, I don't really know what is going on electrically here to make these two wiring styles sound and react the way they do, but I do know there is a difference, which we will get into soon. But first, why are these wiring styles called what they are? Long story short, 50s wiring is called that because Gibson wired their guitars that way in the 50s, and it's a characteristic part of the way those guitars react and sound. And modern wiring really isn't that modern because apparently Gibson switched to using that wiring scheme sometime in the 60s or 70s, so it's still relatively old, but essentially it's your typical standard vanilla run-of-the-mill wiring style that your average guitar is going to have today. And lastly, what is treble bleed wiring? So essentially it is modern wiring, except you now wire a capacitor in between the first and second lugs on the volume pot. And sometimes there's also a resistor wired along with this extra capacitor as well. And the name treble bleed is sort of a hint as to what the difference really is between these wiring styles. And that is the way your treble frequencies are affected as you turn your volume and tone knobs down and how those two knobs interact with each other. That is the main thing that we're going to be talking about today. Now let's get into demonstrating these different wiring styles. So I have 3 guitars today. My Gibson SG is going to represent modern wiring. This B&G Helena is going to represent 50s wiring, and the PRS NF53 is going to represent treble bleed wiring. Alright, so for this portion of the video, I would recommend putting on some headphones because they're going to best showcase the differences between these wiring styles. And the most important thing to understand with this is these 3 wiring styles only make a difference when you start turning knobs. So if I took this guitar and tried all 3 wiring styles on it and then just left all my knobs on 10 and compared them, they would sound identical. So you can only hear the difference when you start turning knobs. So if you're the type of person that doesn't use your knobs on your guitar, then it doesn't really matter which of these wiring styles that you use. But if you are one of those people, then in my opinion, you should learn how to use your knobs, but that's beside the point. So the main characteristic of modern wiring is as you turn your volume knob down, you lose treble. So here's what it sounds like with our volume and tone knobs both on 10. And by the way, we're going to stick to the bridge pickup for each of these guitars. And now here's what it sounds like when I turn the volume knob down about halfway and leave the tone knob on 10. And here it is on 3. So as you can hear, we're losing more and more treble as we turn the volume knob down, and we're getting a warmer, kind of rounder tone, which can be a good or bad thing depending on what you're going for, which we'll get into a little bit later. But another feature of it is that the tone knob reacts how you would expect it to no matter what your setting is on the volume knob. Of course, if you have your tone knob turned down and then you turn your volume knob down, you're going to lose even more treble than you would have before. but it's still going to have the same sweep as it would normally. So here's with volume and tone on 10. And then I'm going to gradually turn it down. Right, so it gets more and more muffled. And then now I'm going to turn the volume knob down about halfway and do the same thing. So here's volume knob halfway, tone knob on 10, turning it down gradually. So in a nutshell, with modern wiring, both knobs reduce treble as you turn them down completely independently of each other. All right, now on to 50s wiring. So I chose this guitar, the B&G Guitars Helena, for this example because it comes from the factory stock with 50s wiring. And out of all of the modern guitars that I've played, this one in particular reacts the most like a vintage Gibson that I've ever played in terms of how the controls work. They're identical to old 50s Gibsons that I've played myself. Out of the three wiring styles we're talking about today, 50s wiring is kind of the weirdest and most elusive and most counterintuitive of the wiring styles in the way that the controls work, and it can kind of take a minute to get the hang of and understand what's really going on. So at a glance, the defining characteristic of 50s wiring is that unlike modern wiring, as you turn your volume knob down, you still retain treble. So you don't lose much treble as you turn your volume knob down, which sounds like this. So as you could hear, it stayed pretty clean and sparkly and clear when I turned my volume knob down, compared to the SG where it kind of got muddier and darker as I turned the volume knob down, which again can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what you're going for. And so that was with the tone knob on 10, right? But where things get weird with 50s wiring is once you start to turn down the tone knob. So with 50s wiring, with your volume knob on 10, the tone knob reacts how you would expect it to, as in it takes away treble as you turn it down. So same as modern wiring there. But say I turn my tone knob down about halfway and then I start to roll down my volume knob. Listen to what happens. Right, so when my volume knob was on 10, it was the normal kind of like darker rolled off treble sound from turning the tone knob down. But then as soon as I turned my volume knob down, our volume dropped a lot more and all of our treble came back. So in that way, your volume and tone knobs become a lot more interactive with 50s wiring. So now let's turn our volume knob down about halfway and see what happens when we just gradually turn the tone knob down. So turning down the tone knob in that situation is not really taking away any more treble until you get to the very lowest settings, like 1 or 2 on the tone knob. And really all it's doing is reducing the volume, and to me, it kind of gives it a little bit more of a scooped kind of sound, like maybe cuts out some mid-range or something. So your tone knob does not work in the way you would expect it to at all as soon as you turn your volume knob down with 50s wiring. And again, it makes it so the controls are extremely interactive when you use 50s wiring. And finally, treble bleed. Essentially, treble bleed kind of combines the best of modern wiring and 50s wiring. So when your tone knob is on 10 and you roll your volume knob down, you still keep treble. So in that way, it's just like 50s wiring. Again, tone knob on 10, turn down the volume knob, you keep treble. But like modern wiring, the tone knob still acts the way you would expect it to no matter where the volume knob is set. So if my volume is set down to about halfway, then the tone knob is going to take away treble like it normally would with modern wiring. So that means treble bleed is essentially the most intuitive one, or it makes the most sense out of all of them. As you turn your volume knob down, you don't lose any treble, and your tone knob always works how you would expect it to. So now that we know what each wiring style does, what are the pros and cons of each one? So the main pro of modern wiring is that you are going to have a little bit warmer of a tone as you roll your volume knob down, which can be good for a brighter guitar if you kind of want to sweeten up the tone a little bit. When you turn your volume knob down and you want it to stay kind of like warm and fat, as you roll your volume knob down, then modern wiring is for you. And again, your tone knob reacts how you would expect it to at all times with modern wiring. The con of that, though, is that it can sound kind of muddy. So say you want to have a nice, clean and clear rhythm tone when you're playing into a cranked amp or something. As soon as you turn your volume knob down with modern wiring, yeah, it's going to clean up, but it's going to be a kind of dark, muffled, muddy sound. The pros of 50s wiring are you, of course, retain that treble as you turn your volume knob down and you get a nice, clean, clear, sparkly tone. So say you're playing into a cranked amp where you have a good amount of overdrive going and you want to be able to clean it up just at the touch of the volume knob, then 50s wiring is great for that. The interactivity of 50s wiring can be both a pro and a con. The main way that it's a pro is that you can go from having a big, thick, fat lead tone to a clean and clear, crisp, sparkly rhythm tone at the slightest touch of the volume knob. You can turn your tone knob down a little bit, say to, about 6-ish, something like that, and then have your volume knob on 10 for your lead tone, right? So that might sound like this. And then all I have to do is just roll my volume knob down just a little bit. And the volume drops quite a bit and it cleans up a lot and stays very clean and clear and sparkly just at the touch of one knob. But that can also be a con, because what if you want to have a quieter, lower volume, cleaner tone and darker at the same time? It's a lot more difficult to get that. I mean, you can find it just in that sweet spot of like the tone knob being on around 1 or 2-ish, but it's not nearly as intuitive and it's difficult to be able to get that type of sound if you want it with 50s wiring. The main pro of treble bleed wiring is that it gives you the most options. It's the most versatile of the three. If you want to have a big and thick and warm lead tone, then you can turn your volume knob all the way up and turn your tone knob down a little bit. If you want to have a clean and clear and sparkly rhythm tone, then you can turn your tone knob all the way up and turn your volume knob down a little bit. If you want to have a clean, lower volume and warmer tone, then you can turn your volume knob down and your tone knob down, and you're going to get both of those. And the controls are going to react in the way that you want them to at all times. So it's the most flexible of the wiring styles. But even though that sounds ideal, there are a couple potential cons with treble bleed wiring. One is that some people find that they can sound a little bit unnatural as you turn your volume knob down. So while it is cleaner and clearer and sparklier, it can be a little bit thin and sterile sounding compared to 50s wiring. And the other con is that you might find yourself having to tweak the knobs a little bit more with a treble bleed. So in that example that I gave with the 50s wiring where I turned my tone knob down halfway, had my full thick lead tone with the volume knob on 10, and then when I turned my volume knob down just a little bit, it got nice and clear and sparkly just at the touch of one knob. Now with treble bleed wiring, in order to have that same effect, I'm going to have to turn my volume knob down and turn up my tone knob because, again, the knobs don't interact in the way they do with 50s wiring. So when my tone knob is down a little bit and then I turn my volume knob down, it's going to be a darker sound. So I have to reach down and turn my tone knob up in order to get that treble back, as opposed to it just kind of automatically being there with 50s wiring. So treble bleed is the most versatile, but you might have to reach down and mess with your knobs a little bit more to get the sounds out of it that you want, which on a gig in the middle of a song can be a little bit tricky. All right, so finally, which wiring style do I prefer? Now, first, I'll say that I can get by with any of them, and I appreciate what each one has to offer. There are certain specific situations where I might prefer modern 50s or treble bleed, but if I had to pick one, I think I would have to go with treble bleed. This is a pretty recent discovery for me because I was always a 50s wiring guy, and I always read that treble bleeds were, like I said, thin and sterile and anemic sounding. But both this guitar and my Mulecaster, which has a treble bleed as well, have kind of shown me the real benefit and the versatility of it. With the right capacitor and resistor values for the treble bleed circuit, in my opinion, it still sounds fine when you roll the volume knob down. It doesn't sound too thin and anemic to me if it's done right. And when it comes to any guitar, the thing that I value the absolute most is simplicity. My favorite control setup is one volume, one tone, three-way switch, no push-pull, no nothing like that. So with that simplicity, I want to be able to have as much flexibility and versatility as I possibly can out of that setup. And as someone who is constantly messing with my volume and tone controls throughout every song of every gig, a good treble bleed is ultimately the best, most useful setup for me. But I still love 50s wiring, and that would be my second choice if I had to pick one. All right, that does it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you could please like, comment, and subscribe, and click the bell notification icon to get notified whenever I post new videos. I am offering private lessons, so go to the link in the description of this video to sign up. I hope you guys had a great holiday season, and until next time, take it easy.